In one of her most unforgettable scenes, Sarah Miles stands still while the world moves around her. Her face is calm, her eyes are not. For a brief moment in British cinema, she was everywhere, on posters, on award stages, in the conversations of critics who believed they were witnessing something rare, and then, almost without warning, her name began to fade. Not because her talent disappeared, not because the audience turned away, but because silence slowly took its place. There was no farewell interview, no final role announced as an ending, only a quiet retreat, wrapped in rumors, unfinished questions, and a strange absence that no one seemed willing to explain. What happens when a star does not fall, but is simply no longer allowed to be heard? Sarah Miles emerged in British cinema at a moment when the industry was searching for something different. She was not built like a traditional leading lady, and she was never framed as a safe choice. Her presence felt unsettled, intelligent, and quietly intense. Directors noticed that immediately. Her rise was not loud, but it was undeniable. Early roles revealed an actress who could communicate more through stillness than dialogue. That quality carried her into major productions, most famously Ryan's Daughter, a film that placed her at the center of international attention. Awards followed. Critical recognition followed. Suddenly, Sarah Miles was no longer a promising talent. She was a serious actress, trusted with emotionally demanding roles and complex characters. To the public, her career appeared secure. She was admired, respected, and positioned within the cultural elite of British cinema. Everything suggested continuity, growth, and longevity. Yet beneath that polished image, there were parts of her life the audience never saw. Choices made away from the camera, pressures that did not appear in interviews, and a private world that would soon collide with public expectations. Long before recognition arrived, Sarah Miles learned how to observe rather than announce herself. Her early life did not push her toward performance through ambition alone, but through a need to understand people from the inside. She was drawn to spaces where emotion lingered unspoken, where meaning existed beneath surface conversation. That instinct would later define her screen presence. Entering the world of acting was not an escape, it was a continuation of who she already was. She approached performance with seriousness, not hunger for applause. Colleagues from her early years often described her as attentive, inward, and unusually thoughtful for someone so young. She listened more than she spoke. She absorbed more than she revealed. Those first professional steps were shaped by discipline rather than confidence. Each role felt earned, not granted. She worked within a cultural environment that valued intellect and restraint, and she fit into it naturally. There was no sense of reinvention. Only a slow alignment between her inner world and the characters she portrayed. This quiet drive became both her strength and her vulnerability. It allowed her to deliver performances of remarkable depth, but it also meant that when pressures began to form later in her career, she would face them privately, without spectacle, and often without protection. Fame arrived for Sarah Miles without asking whether she wanted it. Recognition came wrapped in admiration, but also in expectation. The industry did not simply celebrate her talent, it began to shape her identity around it. She was no longer just an actress working through roles. She became a figure people felt entitled to interpret, judge, and define. Her personal life unfolded alongside this growing visibility, but it never fit neatly into public standards. Her marriage to the playwright Robert Bolt placed her within an intellectual and creative circle that valued complexity over simplicity. Relationships were not discussed in terms of headlines, but in terms of understanding, loyalty, and emotional truth. What existed privately was layered, unconventional, and deeply personal. However, fame has little patience for nuance. As attention intensified, the private structure of her life began to feel exposed. Assumptions replaced understanding, whispers replaced context. Choices that would have remained invisible for others became material for quiet speculation. Not because they were extraordinary, but because she was a woman living outside an easily approved narrative. The cost was not immediate, and it was not dramatic. It appeared gradually. Invitations became selective. Conversations shifted in tone. The The same independence that once defined her appeal now unsettled those who preferred predictability. Sarah Miles did not change who she was, but the space around her began to narrow. This was the moment when success stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like a condition. There was no single night when everything broke, no headline that clearly marked the turning point. Instead, the collapse arrived quietly. Through distance and hesitation, the industry did not accuse her. It simply stepped back. During this period, her name began to appear less often. Projects moved forward without her. Conversations that once included her presence now happened elsewhere. The change was subtle enough to deny, yet consistent enough to feel intentional. What had once been curiosity toward her private life hardened into discomfort. Around her, there were rumors that never settled into facts, stories that connected people, events, and outcomes without ever forming a complete picture. One particular incident, linked indirectly to a figure from the press, lingered in the background as a source of unease. It was never publicly examined, never formally addressed, yet its shadow seemed to follow her steps. This uncertainty became its own verdict, without evidence, without statements, without defense. Silence filled the gaps. Sarah Miles did not offer explanations. She did not correct the narrative, she withdrew further, choosing distance over confrontation. The collapse was not visible on the surface. It lived in absence, in unanswered calls, in the slow realization that she was no longer part of the system she once served. What disappeared was not her ability, but the willingness of others to stand beside her. When Sarah Miles stepped away, it did not resemble an ending the world could recognize. There was no announcement, no statement of intent, no visible conflict played out in public. She simply stopped appearing, not as an act of defiance, but as a response to a space that had quietly closed around her. Withdrawal became a form of survival. The roles that once sought her out no longer arrived with the same certainty. The conversations that shaped careers no longer included her voice. In that environment, remaining present required a kind of performance she no longer seemed willing to give, not on screen, but in life. She chose privacy over explanation, silence over correction. This decision was often misunderstood as retreat or defeat, yet it carried a different weight. Stepping away allowed her to reclaim something the industry had begun to take from her: control over what was shared and what was kept inside. Away from the spotlight, she lived without the constant pressure to be interpreted. The world moved on quickly, as it always does. But her absence lingered in an unresolved way, because nothing had been clarified, nothing had truly ended. The story remained unfinished, suspended between what was known and what was never spoken. With time, Sarah Miles became less a public figure and more a question. Her films remained, preserved in performances that still carried emotional precision and restraint, yet the person behind them existed mostly in fragments, interviews from the past, photographs frozen in another era, memories held by those who once worked beside her. What endured most powerfully was not scandal, but restraint. She never returned to explain herself, never reshaped the narrative that had formed in her absence. Instead, she allowed her silence to stand, even when it cost her recognition. Among those close to her, it was known that she wrote privately, reflections not meant for publication, thoughts shaped by years of observation and withdrawal. One title, remembered rather than released, echoed quietly among friends: The Price of Silence. It was not a confession, nor an accusation. It was a meditation on what is lost when truth is kept behind closed doors. The manuscript itself remained unseen, but its existence suggested something deeper than controversy. It suggested intention. Her legacy now lives in contrast, a celebrated body of work on one side, and a life defined by what was never publicly said on the other. Sarah Miles did not vanish. She chose a different kind of presence, one that refused to compete with noise, and instead trusted time to listen more carefully than the moment ever could. Sarah Miles once stood at the center of a world that rewards visibility. Her face, her voice, her stillness were captured and celebrated. That was fame. It was bright, affirming, and temporary. What followed belonged to shadow, not failure. not collapse, but a long stretch of quiet where meaning was no longer negotiated in public. Her story reminds us that not every disappearance is an escape, and not every silence is empty. Sometimes it is the final space a person can protect when every other space has been interpreted for them. The films remain, unchanged by rumor. The performances still breathe with honesty, yet the life behind them resists summary. Perhaps that is where her truth lives now. Not in headlines, not in explanations, but in the distance between what we saw and what we were never meant to hear. If you remember Sarah Miles, what do you remember first? A role, a moment, a feeling? And if silence had a cost, who do you think was asked to pay it? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and follow the channel for more stories where light and shadow quietly meet. Fame and shadows. Every star has its story.